quite a while. Erie County Clerk, he walked into a real nightmare in several different areas. And it took, what, 2 years, 2.5 years to start cleaning up things, like in the county tax collections office, then in the pistol permit office. He instituted some changes, and then the opportunity came to kind of move up, opening in the 60th district, where we've had some problems over the last, I don't know, 8 years maybe, ever since a gentleman by the name of Crisanti ran, and with the support of many Second Amendment groups, and then kind of turned his back after he was elected. Lost an election, or re-election, to a Democrat, but ultimately was appointed as a judge by the governor of this state in his eternal wisdom. Catch a little sarcasm? Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. I meant it. Mr. Panapinto lasted 2 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was the first Democrat in the Senate to step over the line and say New York SAFE should be repealed, but it didn't go anywhere. So, in any event, 2 years ago, if I remember right, or was it 4 years ago? 3 years ago. Okay, 3 years ago. Chris Jacobs stepped up to the plate. In Albany, he has backed our Second Amendment rights. He's got a big challenge ahead of him with a great unknown at this point. But in any event, he is a New York State Senator, and he is sitting. Represents part of Niagara County, part of Erie County. So, Chris Jacobs, New York State Senator, 60.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. And I took, Kevin, that statement of borders, language, and culture. I think that's a profound statement and the importance of our country. And so I'm going to remember that one. It's really a great honor to be here and see many familiar faces who are involved with 1791 and many who I've known in individually or other organizations prior to 1791 when I was Erie County Clerk. And as was mentioned, when I went in to become Erie County Clerk, there's 5 major divisions, and the smallest division staff-wise was the Pistol Permit Division. But a couple months after I got elected to and took over in the clerk's office, the SAFE Act was passed. So everything really changed. Not for the better for Second Amendment folks, and not for the better for a local government dealing with a major unfunded mandate of trying to deal with that. We had probably 3 times the applications in that first year, and really were overwhelmed. And I'll say right now, I'm sorry it took so long to get a pistol permit. If you would apply during that time, it was really a nightmare. We made some changes. Mickey's doing great things too, and I think he's taken things we were trying to do at that point on, and I think the improvements have been made. But in regards to the SAFE Act, which really dominated a lot of my 5 years as county clerk, two major events will always be with me that I remember. First was soon after the SAFE Act took hold, and the SAFE Act, from what I recall, took hold pretty quickly. It was passed very quickly. I've said to people, it was a civics lesson on how not to pass a piece of legislation, that it was passed in the middle of the night, purely by political interest. The governor had heard that I'm telling you all know this, the governor had heard that the governor of Maryland, who was going to run for president as well at that time, was going to introduce a legislation, so he ran off and did it. There was no committee meetings, there was no hearings, there was nothing. And it was passed and then quickly implemented, and people were scrambling in government that were well-intentioned trying to figure out. But one of the first things, and Max Tresman's here, I believe, both the Tresmans are here, who really came to my aid during this one, where I became aware that some guns of a Erie County resident were confiscated as a result of the newly passed mental health provisions in the SAFE Act. And quickly we found out that that was the wrong person. It was a person, they were looking for a person in a completely different county, but the guns had been confiscated. And the state police turned around and blamed my office, me and my office, that it was our fault, that we were supposed to do more investigation before we instructed law enforcement. We don't even have an enforcement role, really, to do this. That they only had given us a name, when in fact I had a copy, and I gave it to Lou Michelle, of the actual pistol permit and the person's name and social security number. So it was a blatant lie, and the state police scrambling. I generally felt bad for the state police because I think that this law was thrust upon them without any ability of them to have a say on how something should run. And the Tresmans, I believe, took that case to court to defend that young man, to get his firearms back, but I think it was a little longer to get his reputation back, and it was a really tragic event, and a sign that that mental health provision that was passed was, again, just a nightmare in terms of what it did in terms of intrusion on people's personal privacy, the fact that it was causing thousands of private mental health records to be thrown into the internet sphere, because everybody was going to be playing hot potato and sending. If I was a mental health provider or a physician or a psychiatrist that was dealing with somebody, any worry that this person might have something, I'm going to send it to the mental health department. They're going to send it on to the DCJS and so forth. So it was just one of many bad things. The second thing I'll never forget at the county clerk's office was the issue of the privacy of pistol permit records. And the Buffalo News, again, most of you know the situation, and I think it was Rockland County, where a news outlet had asked the clerk in that office, I think it was Rockland, to provide all the pistol permit records of every person's personal data to them, and they in turn put it on the internet and tied it to a Google search, so you could actually search down on Google Maps to see the individual's home. And several weeks had passed, and I was like, I'm glad the Buffalo News didn't think about doing that. And then I got a request, a FOIL request from them, and I denied it. And I was on WBEN, I believe, and someone asked me, have you got a request? And I said, yes, unfortunately I got a request. And we had a lot of calls in our office, and it was interesting because we got a lot of calls from permit holders, those that possess guns. We also got a lot of people who didn't, who thought it was bad as well, that it was just a bad idea all around, personal privacy, that people would know where guns are not, who in a neighborhood does not have guns, et cetera, et cetera. We got hundreds of calls, but I think the Buffalo News got many more hundreds of calls and a lot of subscription revocations. And so they were not happy with me. The next time I went to the editorial board, it was not as pleasant as it had been before. But the one provision I was very involved in that was in the SAFE Act was the opt-out forms, to give people the right to opt out. We tried as much as we could to get that out to people to do that. And we signed up about 30,000 people while I was county clerk, so it would protect them if a subsequent clerk, thank God Mickey Kearns won and not his opponent, because that person, I believe, would have been much more willing to offer up those records. So the opt-out form is better than nothing, but the question I've always had is why do you have to affirmatively say, I want my records private? So I've actually working on legislation to reverse that you're private unless you affirmatively say I'd like them to be public records, because the way I read the law in recertification, you have to re-up again right now. You have to re-opt out, which is just ridiculous. So, as was just mentioned, I've been in the state Senate. I'm in my third year. I had just gotten elected to the clerk's office for a full term, and the leadership of the Senate approached me about running. Mark Panapinto had won that race, and at that point the state Senate was in jeopardy of going to the to the Democrats, and really the state Senate was the only place that was not Democratic, not downstate controlled, and we were holding on by one seat. And I felt it was important to try to hold that. And I was really proud of the campaign we ran, the support we had. The year we won, we were the only seat in the entire state of New York that flipped from Democrat to Republican. And we're able to help keep that majority. Unfortunately, it was for only one term, but I can tell you, I see now what we at least stopped for 2 years. It is utter insanity up there, and about what they're pushing. Second Amendment, abortion rights, you name it, everything is fair game. It's all downstate driven, and love New York City, but New York City people think the world begins and ends there, and they're really showing it and wanting to push their way of life on everybody else. And it's a battle, it's a constant battle. Certainly as long as I'm there, I'll continue to fight, but it is not easy. So that's why groups like this even more important now than they have been in the past. Just wanted to touch on a couple pieces of legislation that were passed this year that were you all know were very bad. The first one I would say it was the red flag legislation. There's just people ask me about this legislation. I said, well, there's one little problem here. It's called the Constitution. It's called the Constitution. What about due process? There are so many violations of the Constitution. It violates the Second Amendment, of course, but all these other elements of Constitution, you cannot trample over these things. And the ability of abuse and the fact that a teacher, or guidance counselor, or coach could say, I am like your dad, and you get the guns taken away, and they're taken away, and then you can you deal with it at a later date. They can even teachers can take from a student they don't even teach anymore as long as 6 months that the student's been out of the school. So it just was a terrible piece of legislation. The proponents did not want to listen to the arguments. They just wanted to pass it. It was rammed through, and then the governor, of course, will support it. Now, people come to me sometimes very well-intentioned on the issue of the red flag with suicides and things like that they knew someone that shouldn't have had a firearm. I believe, as probably most of us here, that mental health is a major problem in our society. But if we want to talk about mental health, let's really talk about that issue and not use it as an excuse to take another shot at Second Amendment rights. And I think, unfortunately, that's what I've seen up in Albany. Really not the desire to take, in regards to appropriate funding at the school level, in terms of what we've done over the last 30 years in closing institutions, and that our prisons are dealing with major mental health issues, and on and on and on. But there's really not the willingness to do that. They really just use every opportunity to go against the Second Amendment. Two other bills I just wanted to touch on. One, prohibiting schools to authorize any teacher or educator from possessing a firearm. Again, as a former school board member, I believe in local control. That's why we have elected school boards, because they know best what is appropriate for their community. But I just can't see, I don't, of course, believe every teacher should have a firearm, but I don't know why, if we have a veteran that's now a teacher, or a retired police officer that's decided to take on another career and be a teacher, why wouldn't you want them, when all the training they have in firearms, to be a line of defense for young people and teachers? So again, there was no desire to talk about a reasonable approach to this, and this was passed. Other one, safe storage legislation. Of course, the real trick in Albany is to find a good name. And you just, you say, how can you not be against safe storage? Well, I read the legislation, and what the legislation does, it requires that the ammunition and the firearm are separate. What if somebody breaks in your house? How are you going to put that all together to do what you wanted to do and defend your family? So again, bad piece of legislation that of course, I believe almost every single Republican voted against. I am a candidate for Congress, so I just wanted to touch on the federal level. In my observation in Congress is it's very similar to what's going on in Albany, so I'm well prepared. I've seen the movie already. They're all AOCs now and trying to push these ridiculous intrusions under the Second Amendment, and using any tragedy, anything to do that without recognizing that they're not solving anything but just depriving folks of a constitutional right. So again, Tom Reed wrote a very good article that was in the Buffalo News a couple weeks ago. The title was Honor the Second Amendment and Address Mental Health Issues. Again, if we want to have a serious discussion about mental health, I'm game to do that. If we want to have a serious conversation about violence in our society, about movies and television, about video games that desensitize our children, video games that are the exact video games that train our military that we're subjecting very young children to, and Hollywood on one end blasts the Second Amendment but doesn't take any responsibility whatsoever on what they do to our youth. Finally, just rounding back with the SAFE Act, if I were fortunate enough to be elected to the Congress, I would introduce, co-sponsor wherever this piece of legislation is that Congressman Collins put forth, the Second Amendment Guarantee Act, which would stop states from being able to pass a piece of legislation like this, like the SAFE Act, that have all these vagaries and intrusions on the Second Amendment in terms of assault weapon definitions that aren't clearly defined. They create a very dangerous gray area for people who are trying to be law-abiding citizens, and give an awful lot of power to folks to abuse that gray area and to use it upon people as they see fit. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions. This group and many in this group that are here were so very helpful to me when I was county clerk. I really tried to take suggestions in terms of how to better serve you in the role, the very important role I felt I had as clerk. And I've certainly in the state senate, and if I'm lucky enough to be in the Congress, I certainly want to be an advocate for the Second Amendment, a strong fighter for the Second Amendment, and a true partner with 1791 and other important groups like this around the state. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
You're elected to the Congress for the 27th District. Part question, number one, who do we have to backfill if you leave the 60th?
Well, thanks for the question, and I've thought a lot about that. I have some ideas, and I will work very, very hard to make sure that seat is kept in Republican hands. I think we have a very good chance because of the fact of who the Democrats are putting up, which is likely Sean Ryan. Personally, like Sean Ryan, but he is a New York City liberal, and he is, name the issue, late-term abortion, gun. I'm sure he voted on every one of these bills I just articulated. He's going to have a hard time. I tell you what, we haven't had enough attention drawn, unfortunately, on this, and I regret that it's going to happen when good law-abiding people are hurt. But the criminal justice reforms, the bail reform, the discovery reform that got passed this session in Albany is going to create really serious crime problems in our communities. And I know Sean voted for that too. So I think that a good Republican, like let's say Lynn Dixon. I hope Lynn Dixon wins for county executive, but let's say Lynn Dixon, who lives in Hamburg, who lives in the 60th district, who has great crossover appeal, great on the important issues. I think she'd be a great candidate.
The second part of that, if you're elected to Congress, would you support the President of the United States?
Absolutely, 100%, 100%. Okay, sure. The question was, would I support the president? I said 100%. Sorry about that.
I just want to clarify, you will support President Trump 100%.
Correct, yes. Yes, Bud.
Chris, there's a bill going around, I believe, that says that gun clubs will not be able to use raffles or use guns as prizes in raffles, and that's one of the major fund builders for gun clubs. What can we do to make sure that they still can do it after the next?
Correct,
session?
yes. You know, for a long time, that was only an assembly bill, and then just recently, a senator introduced it. And, you know, I've been to a lot of gun raffles lately. There's been a lot of them in gun clubs, but also volunteer fire companies. I mean, it's probably their most significant fundraising. So, you know, this bill not only would undermine Second Amendment rights, infringement on the ability for people to purchase firearms, but also it would undermine so many of these important community organizations, gun clubs, VFWs. Can you imagine the cost on the taxpayer if we didn't have volunteer fire companies? I mean, so it's really a double-edged sword. So I don't see it having a lot of momentum yet. I certainly have a better feeling in Albany. As I mentioned, that with the loss of the state senate to the Democrats, and I think we can make gains this 2020. But will we get the Senate back? I don't know if in 2020 we can climb that steep amount. But so I think groups like this are even more important because we need backup because we don't have enough just solely in the legislature to block things. And I would use the best example I've seen lately is the new requirement the governor had put forth on the license plates. Because, you know, the governor believes, I'm not in his head, but it seems to me his modus operandi is, you know, do it, they'll complain for a day or two, and then they'll forget and they'll move on and do the next thing that's going to hurt the people. This one, we stayed on it for a couple weeks. We had broad-based community support. We used the social media was very powerful, and I think it energized the base. And actually, even though people say, it's just $25, we are nickeled and dimed in this state, and this is how a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here, and before you know it. But my hope is that it's energizing people to be aware of the other things that, you know, that we get frankly screwed by. I mean, that over and over again. I mean, I talked over the fees that we pay at the DMV alone are highway robbery. And most of that money does not anything to do with our roads or anything. It's just dumped into the general fund. It's a backdoor tax, and we have so much of that in the state. But my point is that broad-based coalition, certainly the legislators tried to do what they could, but we wouldn't have done it without all those groups. And I mean, there's not many instances where you got the governor to back off. He really, his tail between his legs, he backed off. So I think that's the formula to stop things like this. I think but I think that also a thing like the gun show has broad-based bipartisan support. Democrats would be against it as well. That's something I think we have a good shot at fighting. And you know, maybe it's an opportunity to energize people on other things too. Yes, sir.
Senator Gallivan, I understand, has either introduced or going to introduce a bill where the state's going to cover the cost of the resource officers. Are you going to, the only one that I know of right now that's like sponsoring that is Gallivan. Is that something you're interested in?
Yes, I believe that, I'll have to check, I believe I'm on that bill, you know, there's an example when the tragedy has happened during this session in the legislature, and all these gun bills were proposed. We wanted to have a real discussion about supporting schools with resource officers, with resiliency, security systems, door locking devices, those things to protect our schools. And you know, they just didn't want to have anything to do with it. They wanted, but to answer your question, I am supportive of resource officers, and if I'm not on the bill, I'll double check. I thought I was on, but I will double check.
Well, the last I looked was maybe about 2-3 weeks
Okay,
ago.
I'll check.
Somebody said- Because even in West Seneca, they only have 6 resource officers, and there's 8 buildings. So even though we even have the resource officers supplied by the West Seneca Police, we don't have enough people to even cover.
Yes.
Let alone you get people like Pioneer, Brockton, Central, and those people that are just, they have no local police force except for the sheriff and the state police.
Right. I will check whether it's, I know Senator Galvin had legislation regarding resource officers this session. I'll double check to make sure maybe he introduced something in addition. But I think, as we talk about mental health and resource officers, the more you have, the more they're able to be in a particular school. Then they're more able to establish actually relationships with the kids and be able to anticipate, something's going on here. Or this kid just doesn't seem, he's been different these last 2 weeks, and then tell the counselor to talk to him or something, those sort of things. So fully supportive, I'll check on the legislation. Yes, sir.
You've been in politics for a while. Now, you've been around them idiots in Albany. Now, this pistol permit recertification that was rammed down our throats, is that Nazi regime gonna ever notify us when we gotta recertify, or are they just gonna knock on the door and say, we want your guns? What is their plan for something like that? I mean, you were the clerk, you were in Albany,
Right. I've asked for extensions on the recertification because, there was an example of the passage of the law where, it was a 5-year window, but, it was 5 years also for everybody who had already had a pistol permit. So I'm forgetting the numbers, but it was like 90,000 people were all coming due at that 5th year. There was no way that it was going to work. And when I was in the Clerks Association, over and over again told them, do something about this. And they ignored it. Now the disasters happen. And now we have a gray area, right, where you don't know. So you get pulled over. And
who was in June, who was in July,
Exactly.
who was in August, and all of a sudden the Nazis are gonna show up and you're fucked.
Yep, absolutely.
I can answer his question. I was on the New York State Police site for recertification. And it says right on their site that the New York State Police is not responsible for notifying you when your next recertification is up. They basically wash their hands. They're basically setting up everybody to, take care of it. Unlike our cars, when we get registration and stuff like that, we need to get a bill passed in there that mandates.
Okay.
Makes them more.
That's a great suggestion, because it's certainly not the clerk's responsibility, so that's a good idea. That's a good idea on a bill. And how can you, okay, that's a good idea. Yes, sir.
Just to add to that conversation, in Niagara County, the pistol permit office, for anyone that goes in there to get, a gun put on their card or whatever, they're letting people know the date so they could write it on their card as a reminder. That's the best they can do, but they're trying to help us as much as possible. But you're right, the state's setting us up.
Yes, I'll follow up, I'll send you a reminder on it.
Yeah, that's awesome, thank you. Christian, will you remember that too? Yes, sir.
How many people didn't certify in New York State?
I don't have that answer. I wonder if they know. I wonder.
Last I heard in Niagara County, 40% recertified.
Yes, sir.
There's a provision in the SAFE Act for background checks for ammunition purchases. Is that, I know the governor hasn't signed off on it yet, but he's threatening to. Do you know if you have any information on that?
No, I think there's proposed legislation on that, but I didn't know it was in the SAFE Act.
I'm fairly sure it is. I could be wrong, but I was wondering.
But I wonder how you, see, this is the one thing that, go ahead.
Cuomo had a handshake gentleman's agreement, how he could be a gentleman, I'm not sure.
It isn't.
They weren't going to impose that part of the law until they had an operating system. Because the FBI wouldn't give New York State access to the NIC system, they couldn't do it. Now, California has a system that is up and running. And apparently he's entered into negotiations with California to lease or buy it and implement it here as a surprise, just a present for us. But that could be any day.
No, it's gotta go through the legislature.
I certainly disapprove of that, and I hope you do also.
Absolutely, yeah. This is a problem, the way that Albany is too, the power that the regulators and the administrative has that, this is one thing I've seen since I've been there. I always thought, civics, you pass a law, the legislature does it, it's signed by the governor, becomes a law, and then it's referred to the respective agency to develop regulations, you have input on the regulations and so forth. But the regulatory state in New York State, they pass things all the time with us not having anything to do with it. They use an old law and said, well, it was broadly written enough that we can do it for this reason and that reason. They pass, 5 times more regulations and law in the administrative end with us not doing anything. The vaping is one example. They just did it just now under the guise of, the emergency, but they do it all the time, and the people don't have any say on it. And some of it are as impactful as any piece of legislation we've ever done. Or the fact that they passed the law, but they're holding part of it back, and you don't know when they're going to implement it. So.
They got too much power. We got
too much power. Absolutely, way too much power.
They're not royalty. All they are is people with a job. Take the job away. It's all it is.
Yes, sir.
New York State's pretty much scared everybody away from offering self-defense insurance. But is there any possibility of a self-defense immunity law getting through that would allow the determination of self-defense to be made pre-trial at a lower cost and avoid having to go to trial?
Self-defense insurance. So
Things, well, New York, the USCCA had insurance. If you have to use a weapon for self-defense, it provides lawyers.
if somebody sues you, or if you
Well, to go to
okay, court. Okay. So it's against the law right now in New York to do
Well,
this?
apparently, from what I understand, it's because it doesn't come from the New York State put the kibosh to it using the excuse that it's not underwritten by an insurance company. So that's how they put the kibosh.
Okay.
Of course, that was by design.
Okay.
Cuomo ordered the finance department to go after the insurance companies that weren't so-called New York-based, targeting specifically the NRA, the CCA, and all the underwriters. And it wasn't just our liability insurance for an incident, it also went after firearms instructors, it went after
Oh my God.
police officers. None of those companies can offer insurance in New York State right now. And it just started the same thing in New Jersey. We're waiting to see what's gonna happen, because again, Cuomo has stepped over all kinds of First Amendment, Second Amendment acts to get there. He does things all the time that they have to know, unless they're really stupid, are unconstitutional.
Right.
But he has the whole Attorney General's office that we pay for to fight us.
Right.
We have to fund anything we do to fight him. It just takes time.
I believe that would be the Department of Financial Services.
Yeah.
They are describing the administrative state and then abuse. That is like one of the top ones that does it. And I wasn't in the meeting, but I heard a story one time when we were in the majority and in negotiations on the budget, and somebody said, "If you do that, Governor, you're going to get sued. It's so unconstitutional." And he said, "They're my judges." Yep.
That's the truth.
Yes, sir.
What do you think are your good qualities or assets that will make you a successful congressman?
I believe that, thought about this, I think that in my 30 years in professional life, I've had a good mix of private sector. I've had my own business for the last 15 years, a real estate company. I've been very involved in the nonprofit world. I started a scholarship fund called the Bison Fund for kids in the city, and actually now kids throughout the Western New York to go to private and religious schools. And then I've served in actually every level of government. My first job out of college, I worked for Jack Kemp in Washington, D.C. when he was the head of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I'm in the state senate now. I served for a year. I was Secretary of State under Governor Pataki. I served in the county level as clerk, and I served on local government 7.5 years for Buffalo School Board, which seemed like 27 years. But I feel that I have a good mix of I view myself as a business person, but I understand, how government works and to get things done in government. So that's why when I kind of did a self-analysis that I felt I was ready to do something like this. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody.